The morning air in Blue Ridge carried a heavy humidity, thick with the scent of rain-soaked pavement and the distant aroma of freshly brewed coffee. Richard Nelson stepped out of his car, his polished shoes meeting the cracked asphalt of the precinct's parking lot. Though his presence here was official, his entrance would not be. Dressed in faded jeans, a worn plaid shirt, and sneakers that had seen better days, he looked nothing like the man about to take command of the department. Richard's heart pounded in his chest, not with fear, but with the weight of the mission ahead. The precinct had long been rumored to be plagued with internal issues, from casual prejudices to full-blown misconduct. He had no intention of being another leader who turned a blind eye. Instead, he had chosen a different approach. Before stepping into his official role, he wanted to see his officers as they truly were, when they thought no one important was watching. Adjusting his baseball cap low over his eyes, he took a deep breath and walked toward the station's side entrance. Officers milled about, engaged in casual conversations, their laughter echoing in the air. A few glanced at him, dismissing him just as quickly. No one questioned who he was, no one asked what he was doing there. Just another nobody in their eyes. Perfect. Richard stepped inside, blending seamlessly into the daily chaos. Phones rang, paperwork shuffled, and boots scuffed against the tiled floor. He lingered near the break room, listening, observing. The real test was about to begin. That's when a voice cut through the noise. "Hey you!" A sharp, commanding tone. Richard turned slowly, meeting the gaze of the man who had just spoken, an officer with a smug smirk on his face. His badge read Officer Daniels. And that was when everything began. Richard barely had time to respond before Officer Daniels strode toward him, his boots clicking sharply against the tile. His smirk widened as he sized Richard up, the way a man sizes up someone he believes is beneath him. "You lost or something?" Daniels sneered. "This ain't a shelter. You need to take that mess somewhere else." Richard remained still, his expression unreadable. He had expected hostility, but the sheer boldness of it still caught him off guard. Daniels hadn't even bothered to ask why he was there. He had simply assumed. "Didn't you hear me?" Daniels stepped closer, voice rising for the benefit of the officers now watching from the sidelines. "Get out of here. We don't need people like you hanging around." Laughter rippled through the small crowd. A few officers exchanged knowing looks, as if this was some kind of inside joke they had seen play out before. Richard clenched his jaw but kept his composure. Every instinct in him screamed to shut this man down immediately, to pull rank, to put him in his place. But he wasn't done watching yet. He needed to see how far this would go. Daniels leaned in closer, his breath reeking of stale coffee, and then, without hesitation, he spit. A warm, disgusting glob landed on Richard's cheek. Time seemed to slow. The laughter grew louder, one officer slapping the table in amusement. Another muttered something about showing people like him their place. Richard inhaled slowly, his pulse hammering in his ears. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a handkerchief, and wiped his face, his movements deliberate, calm. "Is this how you treat everyone who walks through those doors?" he asked, his voice measured. Daniel smirked. "Only the ones who don't belong." Richard didn't respond. Instead, he turned on his heel and walked away, heading toward the main office. He had seen enough. It was time to reveal who he really was. Richard walked down the hallway with steady steps, his face unreadable despite the humiliation he had just endured. The laughter behind him had faded, but he could still feel the weight of Daniel's arrogance pressing down on the atmosphere. The police station hadn't changed much since the last time he had stepped foot in one. Same dull walls, same chatter of officers who thought they owned the world. But what had changed was Richard himself. He wasn't the young rookie who used to believe respect was automatically given with a badge. No, he had learned long ago that respect had to be earned, or in some cases, demanded. As he approached the captain's office, an officer sitting at the reception desk looked up. "Can I help you?" she asked, glancing at the badge clipped to Richard's belt. Richard gave a slight nod. "I have a meeting with Captain Reynolds." The receptionist blinked, taken aback by his calm authority. Without hesitation, she picked up the phone and called through. "Sir, there's someone here to see you." A few moments later, the door to the captain's office swung open, revealing Captain Reynolds himself, a middle-aged man with a no-nonsense demeanor. But the moment he saw Richard, his face broke into a smile. "Chief Williams, welcome!" Reynolds stepped forward, extending his hand. "We've been expecting you." The silence in the room was deafening. Several officers who had been casually walking by suddenly froze in place. Conversations stopped. A few of them glanced at Richard, confusion and dread creeping into their expressions. And then there was Officer Daniels. The blood drained from his face as the realization hit him like a freight train. His arrogant smirk disappeared, replaced by sheer panic. Richard clasped Reynolds' hand firmly and stepped inside the office. Before the door shut, he turned his head slightly, just enough to catch Daniels' wide-eyed stare. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. The damage had already been done. The moment Richard stepped into the captain's office, the silence outside lingered like a thick fog. Daniels stood frozen, his breath shallow, eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape. The same officers who had laughed at Richard moments ago now avoided his gaze. Inside the office, Captain Reynolds gestured toward a chair. "Please, Chief Williams, have a seat." His voice held a mixture of respect and caution, as if he, too, understood the weight of what had just occurred. Richard sat down slowly, adjusting his suit jacket. He knew what was coming, the usual formalities, the station's expectations, and of course, the unspoken tension that came with his new role. Reynolds cleared his throat. "First of all, welcome. We're honored to have you here. The department has been in need of strong leadership, and the city is eager for positive changes." Richard nodded, folding his hands together. "I appreciate that, Captain. But before we discuss anything else, let's address what just happened in the lobby." Reynolds stiffened. He knew exactly what Richard was referring to. The captain sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Officer Daniels, he's been with the department for a while now. Not without issues, but he's a problem," Richard finished for him. His voice was steady but sharp, cutting through any attempt at downplaying the situation. "He spit on me, Captain, not just as a man, but as the incoming chief of police." Reynolds exhaled, clearly struggling to find the right words. "I won't make excuses for him. It's unacceptable, and it will be dealt with." Richard leaned forward slightly. "I'll be the one dealing with it." A beat of silence passed. Reynolds studied him, understanding that Richard wasn't here just to wear the title. He was here to change the culture. Outside the office, the weight of the moment settled in. Officers whispered among themselves, some staring at Daniels, others shaking their heads. Daniels, still standing stiffly in place, felt his stomach twist. The man he had disrespected wasn't just another civilian. He was his new boss. And that meant his days of unchecked arrogance were about to come crashing down. In the tense silence following the confrontation in the lobby, Richard Nelson realized that change in the precinct could not be achieved solely through symbolic gestures. With Officer Daniels now under scrutiny, he began the rigorous process of investigation. He walked back to his temporary office, the muted chatter of his officers now replaced by anxious whispers and cautious glances. Every step he took was measured, every glance calculated. He summoned Captain Reynolds into his office, where the two men reviewed files and incident reports that had long been ignored or swept under the rug. Richard's eyes scanned detailed documents outlining complaints, patterns of aggressive behavior, and internal warnings concerning Officer Daniels' conduct. The evidence was undeniable. Over several hours, he meticulously organized the information, cross-referencing each report with first-hand accounts from other officers. He held confidential interviews with several staff members who, under the promise of anonymity, recounted moments of excessive force, racially charged comments, and a prevailing culture of disrespect. Their voices trembled as they disclosed the systemic issues that had undermined public trust for years. As dusk approached, Richard compiled a comprehensive dossier that not only detailed Daniels' misdeeds, but also exposed broader issues within the department. His determination grew stronger. This investigation was more than a disciplinary procedure. It was the foundation for a complete overhaul of the precinct's culture. Richard resolved to confront every injustice, to ensure that accountability would no longer be optional, but an inherent value in the force. With a deep breath, he sent the dossier to the Internal Affairs Division, ready to set in motion a change that many had long awaited. He knew that the road ahead would be fraught with resistance, but the pursuit of truth and justice compelled him onward. Every step affirmed his resolve to reshape the force. The following morning, a storm was already brewing inside the precinct. Word of Officer Daniels' suspension had spread like wildfire, and tensions ran high among the officers. Some welcomed the change, believing it was long overdue. Others, particularly those who had been complicit in Daniels' behavior, were less pleased. As Richard walked through the halls, he could feel the weight of their stares. Some officers averted their eyes, others whispered in hushed tones, and a few glared openly, their resentment barely concealed. He knew this kind of pushback was inevitable. Change was never easy, especially when it threatened long-standing power dynamics. In the break room, a group of officers gathered, their voices low but their emotions running high. "Can you believe this?" One officer muttered. "Suspending Daniels over a misunderstanding? This new chief doesn't waste time, does he?" Another officer scoffed. "It's not just about Daniels. You heard him. He's coming for all of us. What if we're next?" Richard entered the room just as the last words were spoken. The group fell silent, shifting awkwardly under his gaze. He wasn't here to intimidate them. He was here to lead. "Gentlemen," he said calmly, pouring himself a cup of coffee, "I understand change can be uncomfortable, but let me be clear. This department will no longer tolerate behavior that disrespects the badge or the people we serve." One officer, a senior sergeant, crossed his arms. "With all due respect, Chief, Daniels was a good cop. He made a mistake, but we've all made mistakes." Richard met his gaze without hesitation. A mistake is forgetting paperwork. A mistake is misfiling a report. What Daniels did wasn't a mistake. It was a choice. And choices have consequences. The room fell silent. Richard knew the resistance would only grow stronger, but he was ready. He hadn't come here to be liked. He had come to make a difference. While tensions simmered inside the precinct, the outside world had erupted into chaos. The video of Officer Daniels spitting on Richard had gone viral overnight, sparking outrage across the city. News stations played the footage on repeat, and social media was flooded with furious reactions. Community leaders, activists, and even local politicians weighed in, demanding immediate action. Richard sat in his office, watching as a live news report played on the television. A well-known civil rights activist, Angela Moore, stood in front of City Hall, addressing a growing crowd. "This is exactly why we've been fighting for police reform," she said passionately. "This isn't just about one officer. This is about a culture that allows men like Officer Daniels to abuse their power without consequences." Richard sighed, rubbing his temples. He agreed with her, but he also knew that real change required more than public outrage. It required a shift in mindset, both within the department and the community. His phone buzzed. It was an unknown number. He hesitated before answering. Chief Wright speaking. "You're making a lot of enemies, Chief," a gruff voice said. "Daniels was one of us, and you humiliated him." Richard's jaw clenched. "Who is this?" "Just someone who thinks you should tread carefully. Not everyone is happy about you being here." The line went dead. Richard stared at the phone, feeling a familiar sense of unease. He had expected resistance, but anonymous threats, that was a different level of hostility. Later that evening, he met with Mayor Simmons to discuss the growing unrest. "The people are demanding answers," the mayor said, leaning forward. "They want to know what actions will be taken against Daniels and what reforms you plan to implement." Richard nodded. "I'll be addressing the public tomorrow. They deserve transparency, and they'll get it." As he left City Hall, Richard knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just about discipline. It was about changing a broken system, and he was right in the middle of the storm. The next morning, Richard arrived at the precinct to an unusual silence. Normally, officers moved with ease, chatting or exchanging greetings, but today the air was thick with tension. Conversations stopped when he walked past, and a few officers refused to meet his gaze. He wasn't surprised. He had seen this kind of reaction before. Inside his office, Captain Reynolds was already waiting. He looked troubled. "You've stirred the hornet's nest, Chief," Reynolds said, crossing his arms. "Some of the officers think you're here to make an example out of them." Richard leaned against his desk. "I'm here to fix a department that's lost the community's trust. If that makes people uncomfortable, so be it." Reynolds sighed. "You've got some good officers here, but they're scared. They think if Daniels could go down so easily, they could be next. Richard studied him for a moment. The only ones who should be worried are those who think spitting on a civilian is acceptable. Reynolds hesitated, but then gave a small nod. Fair point. Just then, Richard's assistant knocked and entered. Chief, your press conference is in an hour. Reporters are already gathering outside. Richard inhaled deeply. All right, let's do this. Outside the precinct, a crowd had formed, activists, journalists, and everyday citizens wanting answers. Cameras flashed as Richard stepped up to the podium. He cleared his throat and began. The actions of Officer Daniels were unacceptable. This department stands for integrity, and when an officer violates that trust, they will be held accountable. A reporter raised her hand. What disciplinary actions will be taken? Daniels has been suspended pending further investigation, Richard stated firmly. Murmurs spread through the crowd. Another journalist spoke up. Some officers feel like you're targeting them. Richard met the reporter's gaze. I'm targeting injustice. If an officer upholds the law with fairness and respect, they have nothing to fear. But if they abuse their power, they will be held accountable. No exceptions. The crowd erupted into questions, but Richard remained composed. This was only the beginning. He had a long road ahead, and not everyone would be happy about it. After the press conference, Richard returned to his office, but the tension in the department had only worsened. He noticed the subtle signs, officers whispering in groups, sideways glances, and an unmistakable air of defiance. It wasn't long before Lieutenant Carter, one of the senior officers, walked into his office without knocking. His face was tight with frustration. "Chief, we need to talk," Carter said, shutting the door behind him. Richard gestured for him to sit, but Carter remained standing. "A lot of guys are unhappy with how you handled this. They think you're making an example out of Daniels to prove a point." Richard folded his arms. "And what point would that be, Lieutenant?" Carter scoffed. "That you're here to tear us down instead of lead us." Richard exhaled slowly, keeping his composure. "I'm here to make sure this department serves the people with integrity. If that's a problem for some officers, then they're in the wrong profession." Carter took a step closer. "You don't know how things work here. You come in, fire one of our own, and expect us to just follow your lead?" Richard met his gaze. "I expect officers to do their jobs, fairly and lawfully. If anyone has a problem with that, they can hand in their badge." Carter's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. After a long pause, he turned and walked out. Later that evening, Richard reviewed some reports when an anonymous email popped up on his screen. It read, "You don't belong here. Leave before it's too late." Richard set the papers down. "Go ahead." Wallace crossed his arms. "Look, I support what you're trying to do, but you're making a lot of enemies. Some officers are considering transferring out. Others are looking for any excuse to discredit you." Richard leaned back in his chair. "So what? I should just let things slide? Let officers like Daniels continue unchecked?" Wallace sighed. "No, but you have to be smart about this. You're pushing too fast, and they're pushing back harder." Richard was silent for a moment. He understood the logic. Change had to be handled carefully. But how could he compromise when lives were at stake? Before he could answer, a loud commotion erupted from outside. Both men rushed to the squad room, where two officers were nose to nose. One of them was Martinez again, and the other was Officer Reynolds, a known supporter of Daniels. "This department's gone soft," Reynolds shouted. "All because of him." He pointed directly at Richard. The room fell silent. Every eye turned to Richard, waiting for his response. He took a deep breath and spoke firmly. "If doing the right thing makes this department soft, then maybe some of you don't belong here." A tense silence followed. Richard knew this battle wasn't just about one officer's actions. It was about an entire system resisting change, and he was prepared for the fight ahead. The silence in the squad room was thick with tension. Officer Reynolds glared at Richard, his jaw tight, but he didn't say another word. Other officers exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of where they stood in the growing divide. Richard let his words settle before turning to Martinez. "Are you all right?" Martinez nodded. "I can handle myself, Chief, but this department has a serious problem, and it's not just Daniels." Richard already knew that. Daniels was a symptom, not the disease. There was an underlying culture that thrived on power, and now that it was being threatened, those who benefited from it were fighting back. Deputy Chief Wallace cleared his throat. "Let's move on. Everyone, get back to work." The officers slowly dispersed, though Richard could still feel their eyes on him. He knew resentment was building, but he didn't have time to dwell on it. There were more pressing matters at hand. Back in his office, Lisa knocked on the door. "Chief, you have a visitor. He says it's urgent." Richard frowned. "Who is it?" "He won't give his name, but he says it's about Officer Daniels." Richard's curiosity was piqued. "Send him in." The door opened, and a man in plain clothes stepped in. He looked around cautiously before speaking. "Chief Carter, I need to talk to you. What I have to say could change everything." Richard gestured for him to sit. "Go on." The man leaned in, lowering his voice. "I work in internal affairs, and I've been investigating something big. Officer Daniels is just the tip of the iceberg. There's a whole network of corruption in this department, officers protecting each other, covering up misconduct, and worse." Richard's grip tightened on his desk. "Do you have proof?" The man nodded. "Plenty, but if you go after them, you'll be putting a target on your back." Richard exhaled slowly. He had expected resistance, but this was deeper than he thought. If what this man was saying was true, he wasn't just fighting individual bad cops. He was up against an entire system designed to protect them. And now, he had to decide how far he was willing to go. Richard leaned forward, his eyes locked on the internal affairs officer. "If you have proof, I want to see it." The man hesitated before pulling a flash drive from his pocket. "Everything's on here. Complaints that were buried, body cam footage that went missing, and reports altered to protect certain officers, including Daniels." Richard took the drive, his mind racing. He had known corruption existed, but this was deeper than he imagined. "Why are you bringing this to me?" "Because you're the only one who isn't compromised." The man sighed. "I've tried going through official channels, but every time I got close, my superiors shut me down. When I heard about what happened in the parking lot, I realized you might be the only person with the power to actually do something." Richard exhaled, gripping the flash drive. "What exactly am I looking at?" "A network. A group of officers covering for each other, intimidating witnesses and silencing complaints. Daniels is just a pawn. They have people higher up protecting them." Richard felt the weight of the department's history pressing down on him. He had stepped into this role hoping to change things, but he hadn't realized how deep the rot went. Before he could respond, his office door burst open. It was Deputy Chief Wallace. He glanced at the internal affairs officer, then back at Richard. "Chief, we have a problem." Richard pocketed the flash drive. "What is it?" Wallace shut the door behind him, lowering his voice. "Daniels just filed a complaint against you. He's claiming you're targeting him because of a personal vendetta." Richard scoffed. "A vendetta? He spit on me in broad daylight." Wallace nodded grimly. "It's a move to put you on the defensive. If he gets enough officers on his side, they could push for an internal review, maybe even try to force you out." Richard clenched his jaw. He had barely begun to clean up this department, and already the old guard was fighting back. The internal affairs officer stood. "You have two choices, Chief. You can play it safe, let this all blow over, and risk nothing. Or you can use that flash drive and go after them." Richard already knew what he had to do. But taking down a corrupt system wasn't going to be easy, and the battle was only just beginning. Richard sat alone in his office, staring at the flash drive in his hand. He knew that exposing the truth would shake the entire department. There would be resistance, backlash, and even threats. But he had no choice. This was his responsibility now. Taking a deep breath, he plugged the drive into his computer and opened the files. The evidence was damning. Reports of excessive force, missing body cam footage, altered testimonies, all linked back to a network of officers protecting each other. And at the center of it all, Captain Reynolds. Richard leaned back in his chair, his heart pounding. Reynolds was one of the most respected men in the department, but now it was clear he had been orchestrating cover-ups for years. Before Richard could process his next move, his office phone rang. It was Wallace. "Chief, we have a situation," Wallace said, his voice tense. "Daniels just called for an emergency union meeting. He's rallying officers against you." Richard gritted his teeth. I figured he'd do something like this. What's his angle? He's claiming you're out to dismantle the department, that you're targeting good cops over a personal grudge. He's using that parking lot incident as proof that you're biased. Richard let out a slow breath. And how many are backing him? Enough to make this dangerous, Wallace admitted. If they vote against you, they could push for an inquiry. If that happens, your authority could be stripped before you even get a chance to act. Richard clenched his fists. Not if I move first. Wallace hesitated. What are you thinking? Richard glanced at the flash drive. I'm going to that meeting, and I'm bringing proof. Wallace was silent for a moment. That's risky, Chief. If they feel cornered, they might turn on you completely. Then let them, Richard said firmly. This department belongs to the people, not a gang of corrupt officers. It's time we reminded them of that. Hanging up, Richard grabbed the flash drive and stood. He had walked into this department as an outsider, but now he was ready to take charge. And if the corrupt officers wanted a war, he was prepared to fight. The tension in the precinct's meeting room was palpable. Officers stood in clusters, whispering amongst themselves, their faces a mix of skepticism and determination. At the front, Sergeant Daniels and Captain Reynolds stood together, their expressions cold as Richard entered. Richard walked in with confidence, but inside he knew this was a defining moment. Every step he took toward the center of the room felt like walking through fire. He could see the judgment in their eyes. Some still saw him as an outsider, an enemy. Others seemed uncertain, waiting to hear what he had to say. Daniels stepped forward, arms crossed. Chief Carter, he said, his voice dripping with contempt. Glad you could join us. We were just discussing the future of this department. I'm sure you were, Richard replied calmly. He pulled a chair to the center of the room and sat, deliberately making himself comfortable. Go ahead, Sergeant. What's your concern? Daniels smirked. My concern is that we have a leader who doesn't respect the men and women who've built this department, a leader who's more interested in tearing it apart than protecting his own officers. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. Richard let them talk. Then, when the noise settled, he spoke. I understand that change is uncomfortable, he said, his voice steady. But let's be clear, what I'm here to do isn't about personal grudges. It's about integrity, about restoring the badge to what it should be, not what some have twisted it into. Reynolds scoffed. Big words, Chief, but we're a team here. We protect each other. Richard reached into his pocket and pulled out the flash drive. I thought you'd say that, so let's take a look at what exactly some of you have been protecting. He inserted the drive into the laptop connected to the room's projector. Within seconds, a series of documents, videos, and reports filled the screen. The silence was deafening as officers began reading. Body cam footage of unjustified force, altered reports, suppressed complaints. Daniel's face paled. Reynolds' jaw tightened. Richard stood up, looking at them all. This is what's been happening under your watch. This is what's been hidden from the public. And this is why things have to change. The room was no longer on Daniel's side. Officers exchanged uneasy glances. Some looked guilty. Others looked angry, but not at Richard. You say I'm trying to destroy this department, Richard continued. No, I'm trying to save it, but I need to know, who here wants to keep covering for corruption? Silence. Then slowly, one officer stepped forward. Chief Carter is right, he said. We became cops to protect and serve, not to cover for dirty cops. Another stepped forward, then another. Daniels and Reynolds, seeing their power slip away, exchanged a desperate glance. Richard turned to them. You wanted to call a meeting? Well, here's my decision. Officers who stand for justice, stay. Those who want to keep lying and covering up crimes, you're next. The storm had broken. Now it was time to rebuild. Daniels and Reynolds stood frozen as the weight of their exposed corruption settled over the room. The officers who once stood by them now exchanged uneasy glances, realizing they had been blindly following leaders who had betrayed their oath. Richard allowed the silence to linger. He wanted them to feel the gravity of the situation. Then he stepped forward, locking eyes with Daniels. You've had power for a long time, haven't you? Richard said. Used fear and intimidation to keep everyone in line, but fear only lasts until the truth comes out. Daniels clenched his fists. You think you can just waltz in here and take everything from us? he spat. "You're nothing but a political pawn." Richard chuckled. "That's where you're wrong. I'm not here for politics. I'm here to clean up the mess you made." He turned to the officers. "I know many of you didn't have a choice but to go along with this corruption. Some of you were scared, some of you were unsure, but that ends today." He pulled out his phone and made a call. "It's time." Within seconds, the doors to the precinct burst open. Internal affairs officers poured in, their badges flashing as they moved with purpose. Daniels and Reynolds barely had time to react before two agents stepped toward them. "Sergeant Daniels, Captain Reynolds, you are both under investigation for obstruction of justice, falsifying reports, and abuse of power," one of the IA agents announced. "We have a warrant to search your offices and seize all related evidence." Daniels' face turned red with fury. "You can't do this," he barked. "This is my precinct." "Not anymore," Richard said coldly. "This precinct belongs to the people, and it's about time they get the justice they deserve." As IA officers moved in to escort them out, Reynolds suddenly lunged at Richard, rage overtaking reason. But before he could land a punch, two officers grabbed him and forced him back. "Get your hands off me!" Reynolds yelled, his voice wild with desperation. Richard straightened his uniform and looked down at him. "This is what happens when you abuse your power. You thought you were untouchable, but no one is above the law." The precinct watched in stunned silence as the disgraced officers were led away. Then, one officer hesitantly stepped forward. "Chief Carter," he began. "What happens now?" Richard took a deep breath. "Now," he said, scanning the faces of those who remained. "Now, we rebuild. We earn back the community's trust, and we make sure this never happens again." A slow clap started in the back of the room, then another, until soon the entire room was applauding. Change had finally come to the department, and Richard Carter was ready to lead it. The air in the precinct felt different after Daniels and Reynolds were escorted out. Officers stood in stunned silence, processing the rapid shift in leadership. Some looked relieved, others uncertain. Change was always difficult, but Richard Carter knew it was necessary. He turned to face the remaining officers. "I know many of you are wondering what happens next," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Let me make one thing clear. This department will no longer operate under fear and corruption. From this moment on, integrity and respect will define our badge." A few officers exchanged glances. One, Officer Martinez, raised his hand hesitantly. "Chief, with all due respect, some of us didn't agree with what Daniels and Reynolds were doing, but speaking up felt dangerous. We need to know, how can we trust things will really change?" Richard nodded, appreciating the honesty. "That's a fair question, Officer Martinez. Trust isn't given, it's earned. I'm not asking you to blindly believe in me. I'm asking you to watch what happens next. We'll be implementing strict accountability measures. Officers will be retrained, and most importantly, we will be listening to the community we serve." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. The idea of reform was foreign to many of them, but the way Richard spoke made it feel possible. Then another officer, Johnson, stepped forward. "Chief Carter, I've been on this force for 15 years. I joined to protect and serve, but somewhere along the way, things got twisted. If you're serious about turning this department around, I'm with you." A few others nodded, murmuring their agreement. Richard met their gazes one by one. "This isn't about me. This is about all of us. If you're willing to do the right thing, if you're willing to hold yourselves and each other accountable, then together we can fix what's broken." He glanced at his watch. "I want every officer in this room back here at 8 a.m. sharp tomorrow. We'll be going over new protocols, and I expect full participation. This is the first step in making sure that no one in this city, no citizen, no officer, ever has to fear injustice again." A quiet resolve settled over the precinct. The path forward wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long time, there was hope. As Richard turned to leave, Officer Martinez called out, "Chief?" Richard looked back. "Welcome to the department." A small smile played on Richard's lips. "Glad to be here." And with that, the real work began. The news of Chief Richard Carter's appointment spread like wildfire. Social media buzzed with the shocking turn of events, how the white officer Daniels had spat on a man who turned out to be the new police chief. The incident, caught on camera, went viral overnight. People from all walks of life weighed in, some in disbelief, others in outrage, but most in support of Carter taking over the department. At a local community center, a group of activists gathered. They had spent years fighting against police misconduct, and now they finally saw a glimmer of hope. "We've been demanding change for years," said Lisa Howard, a longtime advocate for police reform. "If Chief Carter is serious about turning this department around, we need to make sure he has the community's backing." Meanwhile, at a barbershop near the precinct, a heated discussion was underway. "Man, I don't know," one customer said, shaking his head. "One good cop ain't gonna change the system." The barber, an older man named Darnell, leaned against his chair. "Maybe not overnight," he said, "but let's not act like this don't mean something. A black man is running the same precinct that's been terrorizing us for years. That's a start." Back at City Hall, the mayor held a press conference addressing the situation. "What happened to Chief Carter was unacceptable," she said firmly. "I know what it means to be in danger because of someone else's prejudice. I also know that good cops exist, and I want to make sure those are the only ones left standing in this department." Some officers nodded in understanding. Others remained silent, their faces unreadable. Carter continued, "There will be changes. Training, policies, accountability, everything is on the table. If you do your job with integrity, you have nothing to worry about. If not, I promise you, I will find out, and you will not be wearing this badge for long." A heavy pause hung in the air before Captain Herrera spoke up. "We all took this job to serve and protect. That means all people, no matter their race, background, or status. If we can't do that, then we're in the wrong profession." A few officers clapped. Slowly, more joined in. It wasn't a thunderous applause, but it was a start. As the meeting ended, some officers walked up to Carter, shaking his hand, pledging their support. Others left in silence, their loyalty uncertain. But Carter wasn't afraid. Change was never easy, but it was necessary. As he walked back to his office, he caught sight of Officer Daniels being escorted out of the building, his badge and gun turned in. The man who once spit on him now faced charges of misconduct and termination. Carter took a deep breath. The battle was far from over, but for the first time, real change had begun. Willow Creek Police Department would never be the same again. If you enjoyed this story and its powerful message about justice and accountability, don't forget to like, share, and comment your thoughts below. Would you have handled the situation differently if you were in Chief Nelson's shoes? Let us know. And for more eye-opening stories like this, be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss an update.